Good evening. Thank you very much. And I want to rise a minute for our fallen comrades, for our Canadian Armed Forces. They lived their life for our country. Okay, I'm going to say a Mi'kmaq, my own language, and translation English. Mesta agizideget, nidewisi musigis, helidas wall, akademi delemo, akademi delemet, and eludia, abixictuinen. I was at the Madia, Chila doinen, Tanwagakumantinana, Winch. But I don't come them on now, his Mawidanen, Maulugudnen, my born Marutinen. I was a Mr. Ridgewages, I get the magic, I can limit it, I do know. Lost it about Moodies, Helidas Walnut, Mr. Islegate. Well, all here. Thank you. Creator, forgive us. Open up our hearts. All the pain and sickness that we have inside of our heart to let go. Be able to work together, get together, pray together. Pray for all our children. Pray for all the people that are sick. Take their sickness away from them. Pray for all the people that need our help. Pray for them, help them. Thank you very much. And thank you very much. You may be seated now. Thank you.
There was an understanding in Canada following the Great War that we owed remembrance to every Canadian soldier that died on the battlefields of France and Flanders, that every future generation owed remembrance to those young men that would never be buried in their own country's soil because they had accepted the call to fight for individual and state freedom. We had a responsibility to remember the sacrifice of their spilled blood. This sentiment was acutely felt here in Summerside, where at least 46 of our young men had died. I, Doris Morris, although only 17, deeply felt this responsibility. For I also felt the guilt associated with my joy and gratitude that my older brother, Lieutenant Victor Morris, had survived the war and come home a decorated soldier. It was a miracle that he did, for on Christmas Day of 1916, he, along with other volunteers, crawled 60 feet, cutting through barbed wire to drop among the Germans and through hand-to-hand combat, take a trench that would straighten out the line. Further along the trench, he was shot in the left eye and the temple at close range, but managed to keep going until he reached no man's land, where he collapsed and remained for 5 days until rescued. All kinds of ideas were fielded across the country about what form the remembrance should take. But it was finally determined that monuments most appropriately embodied the idealism, sacrifice, and service of the soldiers. I was so proud when the women of the Abeguit chapter of the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire initiated the monument proposal here in Summerside. They sought out designs and cost estimates and engaged town council in the cause. In March of 1920, Mayor John Campbell called for a public meeting to address the erecting of a monument in memory of Summerside soldiers that were killed or had died in active service. However, the community, and in particular the veterans, felt that the monument should represent all Prince County soldiers that had died, even though smaller communities had or were erecting monuments for their own lost boys. Summerside fondly remembered the Prince County recruits of C Company of the 105th that had trained at the Summerside Armory in 1916 before being shipped overseas. Mayor Campbell then felt it fitting that the Great War veterans be the prime movers of the project, with other groups helping with the fundraising. The Islanders Never Forget Prince County Soldiers Memorial Fund campaign was launched, but the timing was not good. Money was scarce due to all the war effort fundraising, and Prince County Hospital had launched a $25,000 building extension campaign. As well, Town Council had its mind set on buying an electric plant. Monument fundraising was pushed to the back of the list. It wasn't long before there was criticism about the amount of time it was taking Summerside to get a monument. Then there were dissenting opinions about the design and whether it should list all the men that had served, plus the Boer War veterans. Shame on Summerside, newspaper editorials began to appear. Thankfully, a group of guarantors finally agreed to back the $7,400 cost of the monument until the money could be raised. The order was placed with Thompson Memorial Works of Toronto in December of 1921. The women of the IODE took charge of the fundraising and made things happen in a hurry. During the winter and spring of 1922, various groups throughout the town put on minstrel shows and plays. There were hockey games, musical concerts, and banquets. It was wonderful to see the town alive with entertainment. A subscription campaign brought in funds from former Prince County residents living throughout North America. Once a picture of the monument was available, young ladies such as myself were divided into teams of 2 to go house to house selling them as a fundraiser. I felt so connected to the cause and so proud of our accomplishments. By June 21st, there was $4,500 in the bank, most of it having come from Summerside. Dominion Square, right across from my house on Spring Street, was selected to house the monument, which was hoped could be unveiled on Dominion Day, July 1st. I watched from our house sun porch as the monument site was prepared. It seemed to take a long time. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief when the monument arrived at the railway station on June 24th. By the 28th, it was in place, covered by the Union Jack flag, awaiting the unveiling. Dominion Day in Summerside was amazing. Over 5,000 people were present in the town. The papers later reported that cars were as plentiful as houses, as people poured in from across the county. At mid-morning, a parade of the Prince Edward Island Light Horse, the Charlottetown Band, the infantry, veterans and returning nurses, Boy Scouts, and decorated cars made its way from the rail station to Dominion Square. We had never seen anything like it in the province. Premier Bell was in attendance, and Mayor Campbell presided over the ceremony. While the speeches were eloquent and enthusiastically received by the audience, they paled in comparison to the reaction of silence that fell upon the crowd as the monument was unveiled. Though I had seen photographs of the monument, the picture did little to portray the power of the creative work. A 7.5-foot tall bronze soldier, in the act of advancing in battle order, his bayoneted rifle at the trail, mounted on a 15-ton gray granite base, 8 feet tall. The look on the soldier's face captured every fiber of my being. In that moment, I think I recalled the face of every young recruit I saw training at the armory. As soon as I was able, I ran my fingers over the 233 names etched in stone and felt the warmth of the sun upon them. There is so much more I could tell you about the monument. Names from other wars were added to those of the Great War. The battles are named and the dates are correct. But I would rather you visit the monument that has now stood for 100 years and sit with it for a time and let the men tell you their stories. Run your fingers over the letters and feel both the cold and warmth of the stone. Look into the soldier's face and remember his sacrifice.
The boys of the old brigade who fought with us side by side, shoulder to shoulder and blade by blade, fought till they fell and died. Who so ready and undismayed, who so merry and true, where are the boys of the old brigade? Where are the lads we knew. Then steadily, shoulder to shoulder, steadily, blade by blade, ready and strong, marching along like the boys of the old brigade. Then steadily, shoulder to shoulder, steadily, blade by blade, ready and strong, marching along like the boys of the old brigade. Over the sea far away they lie, far from the land of their love. Nations alter, the years go by, but heaven still is heaven above. Not in the abbey proudly laid find they a place or part. The gallant boys of the old brigade, they sleep in old England's heart. Then steadily, shoulder to shoulder, steadily, blade by blade, ready and strong, marching along like the boys of the old brigade. Then steadily, shoulder to shoulder, steadily, blade by blade, steady and strong, marching along like the oars of the old brigade.
Prince County Soldiers Monument is a true work of art. The artist perfectly captures the stance and the emotion of a soldier rushing into the unknown of battle. You can see on the stone there my name, George Tennyson Metherall. It is ironic that I was born into the Western Island community of Fortune Cove. And I never thought of myself as a soldier, but the tribute monument states the fact. You see, I had a great love of life. Laughter and big smiles were as much a part of me as the color of my eyes. I was the kind of person who knew from a young age what my calling would be. I wanted to serve the Lord as a Methodist minister. I thought this path would be a simple one to follow. It's not so. It took time and effort for me to earn the money to be able to study theology at Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick. Although those life experiences I gained ended up being an advantage to me once I started my studies. And I certainly never expected that a world war would break out in the middle of my studies, nor that Canada would send expeditionary troops. I was uncomfortably aware that as I studied, many young men across the country were signing up to fight for the cause of freedom and democracy. It was in my senior year that I understood that my path would take another detour. I could not ignore the call of duty. I knew that if I wanted to take up a position of leadership, it meant that the great weight of responsibility that came with it must also be carried. I finished my courses, but did not seek ordination. Instead, with the forming of the 105th Battalion of Prince Edward Island, I enlisted and began to train with C Company in Summerside. Because of my education, I was made an officer. And I knew that this detour had put me exactly where I needed to be. For as I trained at the Summerside Armory with my men, I sought to inspire them. I helped to build their faith that the cause we fought for was a just one in the eyes of God. I was often called to preach at the pulpit of the Methodist Church, and there, again, I sought to comfort those who were working on the Homefront war effort and to bring hope for those who were preparing to go overseas. It was difficult for me then, upon arriving in England with the 105th Battalion, to find out that we would be disbanded. It was our belief that we would fight as a unit, supporting each other in the trenches. Instead, we were used as reinforcements for other battalions who had experienced losses fighting on the fronts. I was made a lieutenant of the 104th Battalion stationed in England. Again, I used my role as officer to provide encouragement to my men and to calm their fears. I worked myself to exhaustion and had to be put on rest leave for a time. But I was not discouraged, for I knew that I was doing the work of the Lord. It was in March of 1918, in the grand city of London, when I was finally ordained as a clergyman of the Methodist Church. Just a few days later, I was transferred to the 26th New Brunswick Battalion, fighting on the front in France. We were in the reserve in the village of Belcourt, waiting for reinforcements. It was early June and the weather was good, so we were able to play baseball and attend lectures. On the 4th, the battalion was placed in brigade support. Although it was still quiet, so when the work was finished, we were able to play ball and dream of the day when we would be back on island soil. This pattern continued each day until the 7th, when suddenly our enemies began heavy shelling in the area. Of the hundreds of men there, 2 were injured, and I was killed. Just like that, my life was over. A comrade in arms wrote, wondering why a steadfast, conscientious man like me would be called upon to make that ultimate sacrifice. But I ask, why not me? I had simply joined the thousands of other men who paid the ultimate price in the fight for freedom. I ask you now to use that freedom wisely and respectfully in remembrance of those who fought on the battlefield to win it, as well as for those who returned home never the same.
I vow to thee, my country, all earthly things above, and whole and perfect the service of my love, the love that asks no question, the love that stands the test, that lays upon the altar the dearest and the best, the love that never falters, the love that pays the price, the love that makes undaunted the final sacrifice. And there's another country I've heard of long ago, most dear to them that love her, most great to them that know. We may not count her armies, we may not see her king, her fortress is a faithful heart, her pride is suffering, and soul by soul and silently her shining bounds increase. and her ways are ways of gentleness, and all her paths are peace.
My grandfather wanted to live to be 100. He almost made it. He died just 6 months before his objective. It would have been a big birthday party. My grandfather loved to celebrate his birthday. He always wanted a special meal with all of his family gathered around the table, and a birthday cake with all the burning candles. I remember how it annoyed my father that a grown man could be so demanding about a birthday party. He would say to my mother, "Your father is worse than a child when it comes to his birthday." As a child, I didn't question why Granddaddy's birthday mattered so much to him. My birthday mattered to me, so if anyone was out of sync, perhaps it was my father. But now, years later, when the arrival of another birthday can cause me to have a bit of a downer, I think I understand why that day was so important to Granddaddy. My grandfather wanted that celebration as recognition that he was alive. He had survived the Great War. Granddaddy was different from other veterans that returned home from that bloody conflict. Many of the men were silent about what they saw and did on the battlefields of Europe. Not Granddaddy. He wanted to talk about the war. He needed to talk about the war. But there were no mental health workers at that time to listen to him. So he talked to whomever he could, telling the stories of the battles over and over. Nobody wanted to hear those stories. Well, maybe the first time, but not a dozen times over. Even his own family began to tune him out when he would repeat, yet again, an incident from the war. His 2 daughters, as elderly women, regretfully could barely remember the names of the battles in which he fought. Grandma became embarrassed to go places with him, knowing the reaction of people to those war stories. She would warn him before they left the house not to talk about the damn war, usually to no avail. Over the years, Grandma stopped going to more and more functions, isolating herself and Granddaddy more and more. As a child, I loved to spend time with my grandparents. They were already in their 60s when I arrived, and though retired, they still lived on the farm in the summer and moved into town for the winter months. By the age of 5, I thought nothing of packing my bags and spending days with them, never once thinking of home. I became my grandfather's shadow. His chores were much more interesting than my grandmother's. There was the mail to collect at the end of the long farm lane, the wood to chop, the fire to light, the garden to be hoed, and wild blueberries to be picked. Oh, and sometimes we would take the mare, Fanny, down to the blacksmith's to be shod. Granddaddy never did learn how to drive a car. He always preferred the horse and buggy. Granddaddy was also much easier to manipulate than my grandmother, who always seemed to have a dozen chores ahead of her. If I suggested that I had a need of candy, Granddaddy and I were usually quickly hitching Fanny to the 2-seat buggy and riding the mile trip to Mrs. McLeod's small country store, or walking to Mrs. Mose's corner store in town. But no matter what we did, I became my grandfather's audience. I don't even need to shut my eyes to see the 2 of us sitting side by side amidst the blueberry plants at the edge of the woodland, slowly filling our dishes with berries for Grandma to make a pie. Or seated in the buggy, letting Fanny plod her way slowly along the dirt road while I listened to Granddaddy talk. I don't know if he thought that small child was even listening or understood a word of which he spoke, as long as I listened quietly, which I did. Granddaddy was at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, and other campaigns whose names I cannot remember. Snippets of the stories remain in my head. Things like the carnage he saw on the battlefield in his role as both a soldier and a stretcher bearer. Of the day he came upon the young German soldier lying wounded in the field, who begged for mercy and asked him not to kill him. He told of pretending that he neither saw nor heard the young man, who was the enemy, and just kept moving. He said, "It was one thing to fire from the trenches, never knowing if I killed someone, but there was no way I could kill a man face to face." He spoke of his unit marching into a town in Belgium and their excitement upon finding it deserted, because that meant they would sleep indoors that night. But when he entered a house and pulled back a mattress from a bed to check under it, the bugs came out by the hundreds. So it was back outside to sleep under the cold night sky. He spoke of the lice, of the rats crawling over him in the trenches, of the mud in the fields. He spoke of the long marches and how at the end of one long trek, he took off his boots to rest his feet, but they instantly swelled so badly he could not get his boots back on. Why those stories stay in my mind when so many others did not, I don't know. It puzzles me. Strangely, he rarely spoke of being wounded himself and still carrying shrapnel in his thigh. Perhaps his story that stays clearest in my mind is that of a neighbor who deserted. When Granddaddy would tell the story of how the man jumped overboard as the ship pulled away from the dock and swam to shore, his voice would grow hard and tremble slightly. That is the closest I ever came to seeing anger in Granddaddy. Those private moments with my grandfather were special times that as a child I could not fully appreciate. I know I gave him comfort and he gave me importance. Now, when I remember, I feel a deep sadness. It comes from the truth that as I grew older and left childhood behind, I too stopped listening to Granddaddy and his stories. Like the others, I grew impatient. I tuned him out, although I hid it well. Unfortunately, when I finally was ready to listen again, there was only silence, brought on first by his deafness and then by his death. What I would give to have one more afternoon in the blueberry patch beside my big, gentle grandfather, or just one more buggy ride seated beside him with his large hands slack on the reins, I would say to him, "Tell me again, Granddaddy, about the day you chose not to kill the German soldier."